Welcome to the Yale Centre for British Art's online series, At Home, Artists in Conversation. I'm Rachel Stratton, Postdoctoral Research Associate at the Yale Centre for British Art. I'm delighted to welcome artist Celia to our programme today for a discussion on her new book, Letters to Gwen John, which is a series of letters addressed to the Welsh painter Gwen John. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We'll be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Celia. They'll be answered at the end of the program, but please feel free to submit your questions at any time. If you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking the icon on your navigation bar. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Sciaticoke, Golden Hill Pugasit, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Born in 1959 in Trivandrum, India, Paul is a British contemporary artist who makes intimate, sometimes haunting portraits of people and places, often addressing themes of memory, family, and the inner lives of women. From 1977 to 2007, she worked on a series of paintings of her mother, and since then has concentrated on painting her four sisters and close friends. Paul has also made detailed studies of landscapes and interiors, focusing on environments she knows best. Her numerous studies include her studio and central London landmarks visible from her studio's windows, including the British Museum. In 2018, Celia had a major solo exhibition at the Yale Centre for British Art titled The Hilton Owl Series, Celia Paul, curated by Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Hilton Owls. It later traveled to the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California. So welcome, Celia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here, and congratulations on the book, which really manages to be this incredibly intimate and personal account, but also really captures some of the experiences and emotions that I think will be familiar to many of your readers, especially women readers. So by way of introducing this conversation, I wanted to start with an extract from the book. So this is quite near the beginning. The second time I went to America was to Yale. It had been snowing when I arrived. My experience of being abroad was partly soothed by the subduing presence of snow, but it was really the fact that the gallery, the Yale Centre for British Art, owns such a great body of work by you. Your paintings appeared to me like essential fragments of a life blown over the ocean like rose petals in a storm, delicate, broken, unfinished, yet intact, and suggestive of a secret perfumed world, a guarded haloed world, a sheltered rose garden. You guarded yourself against any intrusion, and for this reason you were able to make these silent evocations of your spirit, of your soul. It had seemed a miracle to me to see them here because they looked so fragile, but they have the tenacity of seeds that flourish wherever the wind blows. So I wanted to kind of open this conversation by asking you what it is about Gwen John's work that gives you this sense of comfort, of ease, of feeling at home. And I paired here your portrait of your sister Kate with one of our Gwen Johns in the YCBA collection.
Well, I think for me it's both the intimacy and the intensity of focus, and the way you can see time is built into the image. You can see from her work that she painted slowly. There's a kind of gradual build up of the paint. There's no kind of gestural, attention-seeking quality to her work at all. And it's that spiritual quality that I feel connected to, the subdued colours, which are extraordinarily luminous as well.
And your work kind of, as we can see from this pairing here, really has a lot of similarities. Do you look particularly to Gwen's work when thinking about the poses of your sitters?
Well, I can see in these two, you've paired how Gwen, like the painting of my sister Kate in the red blouse, is. Not all my paintings are quite so Gwen John, but I think we both work from people we know intimately. My sister Kate, Gwen also worked quite a lot from her sister Winifred. Mm-hmm. And this is the model here, I think, is Angeline Louiset, this young woman she befriended in Meudon, who she painted again and again. I think both of us work in sort of series of portraits from one single sitter who we identify with. Gwen was quite extreme in that she wanted everyone to kind of, when she positioned them, she wanted their hair to be like her hair and made them style it particularly, and she showed them how she wanted them to sit. I'm not quite so controlling as that with my sitters, but I do identify with my sister Kate, so that's almost a quality of a self-portrait.
Well, that leads me very nicely onto the next question I have, which is about self-portraiture. This is a subgenre that is kind of really important to both you and Gwen. It's kind of a mode of inquiry, if you like. And this self-portrait of you from April 2022, I was fortunate enough to see in the flesh when I visited you over the summer. And we talked at the time about how you like to paint a self-portrait every month. And that really kind of fascinated me and struck me. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what that does for you, what self-portraiture does for you as an artist, what role it plays, and kind of whether you see parallels in how Gwen John used self-portraiture.
Well, I think out of all the kinds of painting, all the kinds of portraits, a self-portrait, you're confronting the truth in quite a different way to any other subject. And I could only start painting myself after my mother died, really. So I've only really confronted myself as I'm older. And I'm not sure whether it was to do with my mother's presence or what, but I felt suddenly freed into looking at myself when my mother was no longer there. Whereas the opposite for Gwen, she never painted herself in old age. She used models like Angeline Louiset, who were young. She had this sort of emphasis on youth in her work. In this painting by Gwen, it was painted just after Augustus had had a baby with her best friend, Ida Nettleship. And you can see there's a kind of resolve and a new sort of interiority in it, where I think she's decided that she was not going to have children, that she was going to be this, she was going to dedicate herself to art completely. Whereas with me, in my self-portrait, you can see there's a sort of lived-in experience that I think you might guess that I'd had a child from this image. I'm always drawn to portraits of older people. I think Rembrandt's portraits of older people have a quality, a deepness, a depth that the younger portraits don't so often. And maybe that's a quality. But I also, it's a way of, because I try and do them every month, though there's no rules about it. It's a way of my kind of sensing where I am at the moment in the world emotionally. And when I painted this, I was kind of thinking very much about Gwen John and her relationship with Rodin, and questioning my own experience in relation to Lucian. So.
Is that I wonder as well whether you ever think about the life beyond your studio for these works, that your image ends up in all these different places, collectors' homes, museums, and whether that you kind of reflect on that at all.
I'm actually really very, very detached from, once they're out of my my studio, I'd really, really don't think about them. But I wouldn't like to know that any had been damaged or anything like that. But otherwise, somehow I like them just to find their own way in the world without me having much to do with it.
So you mentioned that you were thinking about Gwen's relationship with Rodin when you painted that last portrait. And I want to now turn to these relationships that in many ways, I think it's fair to say, shaped you both as artists. These relationships with older, very established artists. So in Gwen's case, Auguste Rodin, and in yours, Lucian Freud. This is just, I should say, in the book, this is just one relationship of many that you talk about, many relationships with men that you talk about. So you talk about your respective relationships with your father. You talk about Gwen's relationship with her brother Augustus and her patron John Quinn, and as well as your the curator Hilton Als, who kind of championed your work. But certainly your kind of romantic relationships with Lucian Freud and Auguste Rodin kind of occupy the most space. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about those relationships is that you both also were models for these artists. And so it kind of created this complex relationship between artist and model. And I think these two paintings kind of speak to that power dynamic between the artist and the model that sort of came about through these romantic relationships, particularly yours. So I wondered if you could just talk about these images. You reproduced the Gwen John in your book, and so talk about how your work came about and why you chose to reproduce this Gwen John work, and how these relationships with these elder artists kind of shaped you both.
Well, I chose this beautiful, really exquisite drawing watercolor by Gwen John. It's in the frontispiece, isn't it, of my book. well, partly because it kind of obviously relates to the letters. She's holding this letter up to her throat. She wrote a lot of letters to Rodin, and he wrote a few back to her. So I can't quite tell from the gesture whether it's one of her letters that she's declaring her love, because all her letters were very passionate to him. And he, in fact, tried to get her to be more restrained in her effusiveness. But there's also what I'm so moved by, and another thing that really draws me to Gwen, is how when she painted this watercolor, she was feeling such turbulent feelings of being out of her depth with love for Rodin, who, although he loved her, she wasn't, the central person in his life. And yet somehow she manages to rein in her turbulent feelings and produce this work of quite exquisite control and focus. And I think that shows a sort of extraordinary strength. It's a delicate image, but imagine the kind of detachment and control to be able to do this painting when you feel you're kind of sinking emotionally. I really have the highest regard for her. And I suppose with my painting, I painted this painting, it's called, the title is Painter and Model, which is the same title as the painting Lucien did of me and my friend Angus Cook. And I'm standing and sort of pretending to paint, and Angus is lying splayed legs on the sofa in front of me. And there's a sort of gender reversal in a way, although obviously Lucien is the artist and I've just got an angled brush in my hands. But when Lucien died, this painting is dated 2012, and it's partly an act of memorial to do this painting because I did love Lucien deeply, and obviously his loss was a shock and a marking of time. But it was also a way of owning myself as my own subject as well. So I've painted myself with my eyes kind of looking demurely down and my hands clasped in my lap as if I'm sitting again for Lucien. But it's my painting, and they're my tubes of paint, and my dress is covered in paint, paint marks. So I am now the painter in a way that perhaps I wasn't before. And I think in both images, we're using our submissiveness and turning it upside down, turning submissiveness into strength.
I wanted to just, I think it fits really nicely, just read a very short extract from the book, which kind of responds to this idea of the power play between the painter and the model. So you say, the way I think Lucien influenced me most was by his obsession with balances of power within the dynamics of a relationship. My art was deflected from its purpose on several occasions because of this influence. I am not interested in balances of power, or rather, I am interested in balances of power, but not of an obvious kind. And it really struck me that you say not of an obvious kind. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about what you mean there.
Well, I think, I've done groups of figures, mainly of my sisters and my family. And there's a kind of inner dynamic, between people always in interactions. There's a kind of, people are finding each other out, even if they know each other intimately. There's always, people don't flow into each other. They remain separate, however close they are. And so somehow I'm interested in how people, through physical expression, betray feelings of both insecurity or wariness or shyness or admiration for each other when they're grouped together. But I'm not so interested in, like Lucian did, several kind of standing figures with figures lying at their feet, kind of the balance of power, so sort of more, much more obviously.
Conventional balance.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to move on to think a bit more about another kind of subject that certainly Gwen John is very well known for, which is these kind of quiet but very intense interior scenes, like the one that you see on the right. And this, Gwen John, particularly relates to her relationship with Rodin, in that Rodin was very keen that she create an environment for herself that was conducive to what he believed was a good working environment. So tidy and sparsely decorated. And so this painting has been sort of discussed or analyzed as a kind of an answer sort of for Rodin, to show him a space that the space that she's created that is inviting for him. I see that as being really quite different from what you are doing with your interior scene here. And you write in the book that about your studio space, which, like Gwen John's, is also where you live, and you guard it quite closely. So you talk about how you never gave your husband Steve a key to your flat, your apartment, and your son Frank also knew not to step foot in your studio when he was with you. So what I'm interested in is how you have set up your studio to be a space that allows your creativity to kind of flourish. And whether, like for Gwen John, these spaces are a kind of self-portrait, whether your studio space in any way kind of reflects you.
Well, I think it's when in her final years, she became a complete recluse. And her studio then became just as barren and stark as mine is. And that was when she no longer wanted to be visited by lovers. And I think in this, as you say, in this beautiful interior that she painted here with a little vase of flowers and the pretty parasol and the sort of honey-coloured light. It's the most enticing interior, isn't it? And somehow the way that the chair is positioned, inviting, she she wants Rodin to come and sit on her. And whereas for me in mine, because of having a child, I had to be very, very ruthless about carving out my own space, and more ruthless about my privacy than I probably would have done otherwise. And also because of my experience with Lucian, who used to like to suddenly surprise me and turn up at 3 a.m. or something. I mean, I never gave him a key, but somehow it was a way of kind of fending off visitors. And I think the way that my chair is faced with its back to the viewer, it's very, very unwelcoming. It's like a sort of no entry sign. I'm not sure I always want to be like that, but it's how it served me very well.
And I should just say for our audience that this painting, My Chair, it is almost how your studio come living space is. You have very, very little furniture in it. You keep it very kind of sparse, as you mentioned. So this is not a staged image. This is very much how you live and work. And it's always very interesting to me to see how artists, the environment in which artists need to work,
I mean, this is a beautiful space, as you know. It's kind of faces north onto the front of the British Museum, and I'm up very high, so I get a real sense of London sky, and I've never seen a more beautiful place for the light, actually.
And you talk often in the book about, needing to kind of quiet yourself in order to paint. And I really got the sense from your studio that it is a place where you can quiet yourself, because it's, there are very few distractions.
I don't know if you can hear from there, because it's on a very busy street. It's quite noisy, the traffic. I don't know if that's coming out onto the...
No, we're actually not hearing it too badly, but yeah, I do remember that from when I came. So you mentioned that, you needed to kind of carve out your own space because you did decide to become a mother. And this is an area where you diverged from Gwen John, because Gwen John never did become a mother and decided, as you mentioned quite early on, that was not something she was going to do, it seems. And I want to read again a little extract from your book about how you felt, how you experienced other people's kind of reactions to your being a mother. And it's something I felt quite personally kind of familiar with. I read your book shortly after I'd given birth to my son, and as I was kind of readying myself to go back to work, and this kind of really resonated with me, and I think would with many women. So this is what you say. There was no way in the world's eyes that I could be a good mother, and I wanted to be a good mother now, while at the same time being a painter, wholly committed to her art. I should be straightforward and make a proper home for my son, said the world. But my desire was for the shadowy crime of painting. I longed to be alone, to create my unsettling art. This just for me really kind of articulated this tension between the necessary selfishness of creative practice and the kind of expected selflessness of motherhood. And I wondered if you could kind of talk about how you navigated that tension, and whether becoming a mother sort of shaped your artistic practice.
Well, it's, as anyone knows, it's tremendously difficult. I think it's very, very difficult to paint or produce art with the same commitment if you're in a position of responsibility for somebody else, in a caring position. I think somehow the act of caring and the act of creating come from the same source, so that you can't do both. I mean, like Gwen called her and Rodin's, Rodin's sculptures of her, their babies, and she somehow, for her, the paintings and sculptures were her children. For me, obviously, I had a real child. And when he was little, my mother was the main carer, actually, which was another source of pain for me, because obviously I deeply loved him and, you know, ideally would have loved to be both, would have loved to look after him and paint. But I am committed to my art. But when he was older, he did, I took responsibility over from my mother, who felt she was, too old to take on the full responsibility that she had before. And that really did impact on my art. And for quite a few years, I really, really struggled. I would do the discipline of going into my studio to try and paint, but my thoughts were all with my son, and somehow nothing worked. Everything was kind of overly laboured and strained that I tried to do. I think a different kind of artist maybe can balance the two. I mean, I know, quite a few very successful women artists who've had children who've somehow managed to balance the two. But because my focus is, I need to think and plan and spend time alone before I paint. I can't just kind of go into the studio and produce a big canvas. It requires a tremendous amount of preparation, and I have to have an image in my head of what I need before a painting can really work, which does require a quite different kind of discipline, I think.
And you talk about, so Gwen John, while she didn't have children of her own, she was, as we can see from this absolutely kind of exquisite drawing of a child, very capable of capturing children and the kind of innocence and intimacy that they exude. And you talk about the fact that this was really the only one of very few paintings of your son that you were able to do. What do you think, and that's interesting, given that most of your, all of your painting is people that are very close to you, and he is someone that's close to you. So what is it about that relationship particularly that made it a kind of, you unable to represent him in paint?
I think my love for my son completely knocks me sideways. I think I'm so cowed by my love for my son that it feels strange for me to be the one in the standing position. Something about my love for him makes me want to kind of serve him and look after him, and not be in that kind of powerful position of artist. When he was little, I did quite a lot of paintings of him, actually, with his grandmother, my mother, which I think I'm ever so pleased with. They're very, very tender. But then when he was about 12, which is when we kind of, this sort of natural separation, you'll come to it with your son, Henry, I think, where just suddenly a boy does no longer hug his mother. And there's a very different relationship is set up. And I found that very, very difficult. And at that point, he utterly refused to sit for me again. When he was 26, he sat for me again for a couple of times, but he wanted to listen to audio cassettes because he finds stillness very, very difficult. I usually paint my other sitters in stillness.
So that actually leads very nicely onto these two paintings, particularly the one of your mother, my mother, and God. Religion is Christianity specifically as something that you and Gwen shared an interest in. While you're not religious necessarily yourself, you come from a family of pastors, and your mother talks about using the time while she was sitting for you to pray, and that it was a gift for a Christian to have that time. And Gwen talked about wanting to be God's little artist. And there is this sense with both of you that painting has this kind of a religious call for you both, and is kind of deeply bound up with spirituality. So I wondered if you could talk about, how art relates to your spirituality.
Well, I think about God all the time, and I think Gwen probably did. Maybe everyone does. But the act of painting for me is quite similar to the act of prayer. You have to kind of completely give yourself up if anything's going to happen at all, which is very like mystical thought in a way. You have to lose yourself in order to find yourself, which is very different actually to the act of writing for me, where I feel I'm very much the one in control. Whereas for painting, I feel I'm freed from control, that it's somehow not in my hands. And I think these two images are in a way quite contrasting. Both Gwen and I admire the writings of St. John of the Cross, the mystic, who's pretty tough, he wrote, the dark night of the soul, that you have to go through this period of absolute loss of self, loss of desires, to actually get to a deeper truth and knowledge of your true self. And so in my painting, this experience of darkness behind my mother, which contrasts so much with her individuality, her living presence, the mystery of that darkness that to go through. And when I showed my mother, she said, "Oh no, it's not like that at all," because for her, she was deeply religious, but it gave her peace and comfort. Whereas I suppose for me, I'm much more kind of self-flagellating about it, and feel that that the darkness is quite essential. But I feel with Gwen's painting, there's a real gentleness and peace. So I think she's much more akin to my mother's view of religion in this painting, even though she was very kind of, she denied herself a lot. But she never really worked well from old people. And the model she uses here is a young woman, even though she was commissioned to paint the foundress of the convent in Merdon, where she went, who had been a very old woman. She replaced this old woman by this sort of beautiful, peaceful young woman. So I think there's we have quite a different take on God in both these images.
I want to just briefly, before I have two kind of questions left. So I wanted to talk a little bit about COVID and the sort of impact that had on you. So the book, Letters to Gwen John, was written, during COVID. You talk in it about the lockdowns and the isolation, and you also talk about the extreme distress of being separated from your husband, Steve, shortly before he died, which was on March 29th, 2021, which was the day that the lockdown restrictions in Britain actually lifted. So this period of COVID was kind of tied up with, if it wasn't already kind of tied up with a sense of loss, this kind of compounded that. But it also, from your book, seems to have been a moment of reflection, and you painted this piece during that time on the left of you, Lucian, and Bella. And so I wanted to ask you really whether you kind of feel that you've emerged from COVID a different artist, and were you able to kind of sort of interrogate something about your past through this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was working on the Gwen book throughout the pandemic as well. And I think for me, in the left-hand image of Bella and me and Lucian, it's called Looking Back, because Lucian is the one that's kind of looking out at the viewer. And I really struggled to get his likeness. I kept kind of doing a cartoon kind of version of Lucian, whereas both Bella and I came quite easily. And I was quite challenged and interested by why I found it so difficult to capture Lucian. But when I did, it was extremely empowering. I felt, actually, I have captured him. And I don't know how pleased he would have been by me having captured him. There is something about when you get a true likeness in a portrait, you have in some way captured their soul, and it becomes yours. And the one of Steve is a big watercolor. It's 56 by 56 inches. And I started it in 2017, before he was due to have major surgery. And I knew that I would complete it when I knew that, he didn't have long to live. So there was a feeling of kind of working against time in this. And I was completely isolated. For 6 months, I saw no one apart from my husband and hospital staff. And then the irony of the lockdown easing on March the 29th. So my sort of aloneness, it seemed extremely cruel. So it was a dark time for me, but tremendously inspiring. And so often the most difficult times in one's life, you produce the best work.
Mm. So finally, before we move to questions, I wanted to end by looking at these two works, because I think that firstly, they're recent. These are not in the book. They were produced since you published the book, and they really speak to your feelings, not just as a woman and an artist, but as a woman artist. And I wanted to read a little extract. You say in the book, male artists are very competitive with each other. As a woman artist, you can choose to enter the ring with the men, or You can choose to step quietly outside the ring. You and I have done this, and all the women artists I feel most deeply connected to have done the same. Women hold this great, mainly untapped source of inner strength. We need to hold that and guard it. Only by being withheld can we access this strength. So I wonder if you could talk about these two works that have kind of emerged since the publication of the book, since COVID, and how, and they have this real sense of empowerment, I think, and it would be lovely to hear your thoughts on them.
Well, the one on the left, I've titled Ghost of a Girl with an Egg, because when I was 20, I'd been going out with Lucien for 2 years, but this was the first painting he did of me. And I was a very romantic, self-conscious young woman who found it difficult to be naked in any context, but to lie in front of Lucien, who I was passionately in love with, and to be scrutinized, and then to be objectified by the comparison between my breasts and the eggs, or I found it a deeply difficult, painful experience to sit for that painting. And so when I painted my own version, which is actually a really very, very big painting, one of my biggest, it's kind of 6 foot by 5 foot. And Lucien's painting, which is Naked Girl with an Egg, I think it's called, is quite a small painting. So in a way, that was a sort of, I don't know, I wanted to make a statement. But I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that, I'm lying there completely vulnerable with my head turned away. There is no way I am in a position of power in that image. And yet I've somehow produced a work of strength through that, in that very inwardness, by kind of completely making myself vulnerable. I've given myself a lot of power. And I think you can see the same with the image, which is, the title is Gwen John posing for Rodin. You can see the sort of tension in her neck, how she's so wanting to give Rodin everything. She wants to do, she doesn't mind what position he asks her to hold. She'll do anything for him. And yet, even at the time of her submissiveness entirely to him, she was producing works of, timeless strength that will, survive for all time. They're so powerful. And she, in her way, made her own quietness her strength.
I think that's absolutely right. And I feel like you, as this more mature artist, have reclaimed both your younger self and Gwen John in this incredibly powerful way. I'm going to stop our screen share now, and we will turn to some questions. So Julian Sands says, there is something metaphysical, almost preternatural about your self-portraits, portraits and landscapes. Are you conscious of entering another state of being when you paint?
That's lovely to hear from you, Julian. I think the act of painting myself is in some ways different, but not so different to other paintings I do. When I first start painting the self-portrait, I'm looking in the mirror, but then after I've kind of got the head and shoulders in position, I turn it away from the mirror and kind of dream myself up onto the canvas. So in that way, it is in another kind of state. It's kind of a dream rather than direct observation.
A more kind of factual question here. And Cosgrove asks, hi Celia, from what age were you first aware of Gwen John? And what did Lucian think of Gwen's portraits? It's interesting.
Well, I think that's quite a difficult question about when I first, because partly everyone has always sort of compared me with Gwen. I mean, very flatteringly, but when I was at the Slade, because Gwen John was also at the Slade School of Art in London, when I was at the Slade, Germaine Greer came into the Slade to make a programme for the South Bank show of comparing me with Gwen John, a contemporary art student, with Gwen John. She was doing a programme about the Slade. So somehow it's come from outside as well as inside. And I know my early drawings, Lucian thought were like Gwen John's drawings. And I think Lucian admired Gwen John a lot. He thought she was actually, for him, the greatest female painter. I don't think he felt anyone could compare with her, apart from some of my paintings. I think he thought might have been up there. But yeah.
Another question here. There's an exhibition at the moment of painting by Alice Neal of the same sitters at different points in time. Have you ever consciously investigated how the dynamics of power shift in a relationship between sitter and artist over time through multiple pictures of the same sitter, e.g., for example, your sister?
Well, I think that's very interesting because I painted my mother over, 30 years stretch of time, in which time she did age, obviously. So my early paintings are different, but somehow the power dynamic wasn't how it might generally be thought of, because in fact, I grew closer to my mother as she got older. And I think my paintings became more and more compassionate towards her. And I think she became a more and more powerful presence as she grew older, which is the opposite, I think, in a way. There's most, I mean, I've seen the Alice Neal exhibition at Victoria Miro. It's so incredibly powerful. And there are two paintings of Alice Neal's mother, one when she was sort of, I don't know, must be sort of in old age, but not final old age, whereas the last painting next to it, where she's really entered the zone of real old age, it's so touchingly, heartbreakingly true and moving. My mother, because in her very last years, she was really too frail to sit for me in the same kind of rigorous way that she had. Although I did little drawings of her, after a certain age, I didn't paint her in her final kind of complete, those final stages.
This is a question here about writing versus painting. So does the process of your writing mirror the manner in which you paint? That is, a need for periods of isolation and limited distractions?
Well, actually, I find the process of writing even more isolating than painting. I know that because I've written 2 books now, and for both the occasion of the writing, I simply couldn't, meet people or go out or travel, certainly. Whereas with painting, it somehow often refreshes me to go away and get some distance on what I'm doing. Whereas with writing, I seem to have to just completely focus on that. So I think it's to do with the sort of control I was talking about with writing. I feel I have to be completely in control, whereas with painting, the opposite is true, so that I allow in more freedom.
But I will, if I may, just take the very last question, pose the very last question to you, which sort of comes out of what you just said. You've kind of talked elsewhere about the different roles that writing and painting play for you. So you've talked about writing being this kind of exorcism. You expel something and then it's out, whereas painting is this kind of ongoing, never-ending process of inquiry. And so I wondered whether, just by way of conclusion, you could talk about whether you feel that writing Letters of Gwen John has kind of exercised something for you, and what that is and how you kind of emerged differently from it.
I think writing is so it's so like a journey on the ground. It's like following a road. And whereas painting is like seeing something from the air, so you see it all at once, whereas the actual journey of writing is quite different. And I've felt when I've had issues to deal with, in this case specifically to do with loss, actually, and heartbreak, I've had to do it through writing, because I've needed to go along the kind of ordinary terrain of my ordinary feelings. Whereas there's something much more transcendent about the actual act of painting, where you just, you can rise above your feelings, whereas writing, you sort of deal with your feelings.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me, Celia. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you to the Public Programs Department, Linda, Jane and Malik. And bye. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. So lovely to meet you again, Rachel. Bye-bye.